confess that I have him to thank for being nervous this morning, because he was the one that suggested me. Thank you, Andrew, as well. I've served as past president of the Northeastern Division, current president-elect for the Pennsylvania chapter and the fish habitat section for AFS. Andrew mentioned the importance of meetings and connecting. One of the fond memories I had of AFS is the first annual meeting I attended, and that was at Lake Placid, New York in 2006. I'm sure there are people in this room that were responsible for planning that meeting. I made the decision probably 2 or 3 weeks before to drive up as a graduate student in law school from State College to attend. And I didn't have a talk or presentation yet. People at the meeting made me feel welcome, that I came as a student wanting to learn. And so that had an impact on me in wanting to remain a member of AFS, and we'll see now some of the volunteer work that I've done and engagement as part of larger teams. So those that planned that Lake Placid meeting, thank you. And fond memories of that meeting, and 20 years later, I'm just excited to be here to address some of the work that I'm doing. So today I'm going to talk about some of the things the AFS is doing, engaging on the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and things that I'm doing to try and train students to communicate science to policymakers. I want to recognize my current research group. I'm not really here talking about the work going on, but I'm here today because they're covering for me back for my classes. So Andrew Fetters and Stephanie Vaughn are postdoctoral associates working in my research group. PhD students Koshali Banerjee, Bethan Everly, and Sarah Khan. Koshali and Sarah were helping cover for my classes while I was out of town this week. And looking for opportunities to collaborate. For example, they're meeting this morning to discuss wilderness and fisheries, particularly after a case was just decided out in the Colorado River Basin. So there's opportunities for people to join us on dealing with some of these important issues for fisheries. And then many AFS members have contributed to the policy work that I'm going to talk about today. I especially want to recognize Sue Colvin, Leanne Wilson, and Tom Bigford. They've been involved with a couple of these projects, including leading these efforts. I also want to recognize recently deceased AFS members Bob Hughes and Vijay Sullivan. They were leaders on some of the efforts with the Clean Water Act, and we greatly miss them. Sue recently wrote a touching write-up of Bob Hughes and how he was a mentor to so many of us early career professionals in the society. I want to recognize them because of the importance of teamwork in dealing with these policy issues. So I'm going to start off this morning with the goal of the Clean Water Act. It's to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. And I reminded the Trump administration representatives of this a few weeks ago when they had an open session in Pittsburgh. They chose 3 locations: Bismarck, North Dakota, Bismarck, South Dakota, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then online. And there was a room of mostly agency personnel there and political appointees in the Trump administration. And I was there because we need to be engaging on this issue. And I got up and reminded them what the purpose of the Clean Water Act is because of the recent regulatory changes with respect to how we define waters of the United States that I'll get into in a moment. And I reminded them that when scientists start showing up to public meetings, when they have grades due the next day for the end of the semester, and when they're not being paid to be there, like, they've messed up in how they've defined what waters of the United States includes. And I think back to when I was first working as a resource professional after my PhD. I got a job as a consulting agency, as an ecologist and project manager. My wife got a job at the University of Pittsburgh. We're both from Pittsburgh, just outside the city, and so we were excited to move back. And within 2 months of the job, I had done a couple of wetland delineation projects, and this second project I had done, there were wetlands on a construction pad site that the owner had let sit for a decade. And what happens when you let construction pad sites sit? Well, if you have hydrology and you have a seed source and soil, you're likely to get wetlands. Well, in my report, I gave it to the senior engineer, and he said, there are wetlands on here. We can't show this. He's like, we're gonna have the site bulldozed, and you'll go back and redelineate after it's bulldozed. And I got really hot And I walked back to my office, and I sat there for 2 minutes. I pulled up the Code of Ethics for the Ecological Society of America and the American Fisheries Society. And I walked back and I said, what you're asking me to do is a violation of the professional standards of the professional societies to which I belong, and I won't do it. And they stopped passing on work thereafter. I was terminated 7 months later. I had a major project with the tribe of Wisconsin I was able to secure that extended my time a little bit, but the writing was on the wall when they stopped passing on that I didn't do what they had expected. But I wasn't going to compromise my integrity for this. Ironically, they got caught, not because I ratted on them, but because this is right next to an LA Fitness, and someone saw that they didn't have silt fence up when they were bulldozing the site. I mention this because the importance, and what I had said to them was, I can argue these are non-jurisdictional. Like, this was clearly a construction pad site that was planned. But what I can't argue is there aren't wetlands there, and I can't sleep at night if I know what was done as a result of those actions. And so I recognize that this happens on a regular basis. This is a development that happened near my house that ignored prior agency maps showing a spring seep tributary from the EPA and Army Corps of Engineers that entered the stream. The later consultants didn't put the spring seep tributary. They started cutting trees near the hill slope, and hopefully the video plays. This was my neighbor that took this video. So I overlook Saratoga Run that feeds into Little Buffalo Creek, that feeds into Big Buffalo Creek, that feeds into the Allegheny River, the Ohio River, Mississippi, Gulf of Mexico. So these are choices that local communities are allowing to happen. And when I went to my municipal government, I said to the township supervisors, hey, here's what's happening. It's not our problem. And I said, I want to photocopy the maps and plans, and I got it. And there were wetlands and spring seeps that were connecting directly to to Saratoga Run that were missed on the later maps. And so what I argue is that we in society cannot reach our fisheries production potential in freshwater and marine environments without actually addressing these on-point source pollutants. And the Clean Water Act has been our tool for getting there. Section 404 establishes a program to regulate the discharge of dredged or fill material into waters in the United States, which includes wetlands adjacent to waters under Section 404. So what is the Waters of the United States rule under the Clean Water Act? Well, 1972 amendments to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, because it wasn't being effective in reducing water pollution, established federal jurisdiction over navigable water in the Act as waters of the United States. However, Congress did not define what WOTUS meant. Rather, it provided authority for the EPA and the Department of the Army to define WOTUS through regulations. WOTUS includes, but is not limited to, navigable waters. And this is an image showing those jurisdictional waters of the United States by Sarah White from State University. So the origin of protecting navigable waters is kind of strange, because it develops out of Roman law and the Magna Carta in 1215. The Magna Carta was signed by King John of England and brother barons. It was a product of a political crisis. They were wanting to force the king out because the laws were subject to the royalty's whims. And so though the king owned navigable waters, the crown was obligated to protect them for the public as a result of this agreement. And it's also including removal of fish weirs impeding navigation. So local communities that were catching fish in the Thames River had all of a sudden stopped putting fish weirs in to protect navigation for commercial channels. And this has an influence on how our law under the Clean Water Act was structured. So the American Fisheries Society has been engaged on this issue on defining waters in the United States. And the EPA, after the Sackett versus EPA decision in 2023, that I'll get to in a moment, changed the rule, had to change the rule as a result of that court decision. So on November 17th, the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers put out the revised rule and only gave 45-day comment period. AFS requested, and other scientific societies requested a longer time. We didn't get it, and so we had to scramble. And thankfully to members of the team and Drew Winters, Jeff Kapaska, and others helping coordinate the efforts, we put together our team to address this on a short notice. And so in this month's issue of Fisheries, Mind the Gap, where revised rulemaking fails to meet the science and legislative intent on defining waters in the United States, we set out some of the problems that we see with the current definition and where we have to go next to protect our water quality. One of the problems with weakening this law is that it will cause pollution problems downstream for others. So one of the projects that I've been involved with, in part because of standing up for myself and maintaining that integrity, one of the other municipal engineers that works in the area, Ron Olson, reached out to me to help him with wetland and stream restoration planning projects for a couple townships west of mine. And so under the MS4 program, under the Clean Water Act, areas that are urbanized or urbanizing have to address non-point source pollution within the MS4 program. And one of the ways they can do that is to restore some of the past sediment and nutrient problems. Here was a stream that was covered with this legacy sediment, and Phil and I were down 2 meters in one of these soil pits until we hit the actual floodplain rock. And so these are going to require extensive amount of work to put back to a historical trajectory. And one of the things I've been doing is communicating to my local supervisors, hey, are you willing to prepare to deal with the cost of this if you don't deal with the non-point source pollution like you saw running off from that development site? So the waters in the United States definition is important because headwaters comprise over 79% of river length and drain over 70% of land area. So this was a publication in Fisheries that we had in 2019. And since this, there have been newer efforts that even expand this effort for first to third order streams and the importance of intermittent and ephemeral streams to our river networks. And so what happens in these headwater streams is delivered downstream to downstream users. And some of the key concepts in the Waters of the United States rules and in the law, under Section 4.4G in the Clean Water Act, Congress excluded from states the ability to issue permits for the discharge or dredged or fill material into wetlands adjacent to navigable waters used to transport interstate or foreign commerce. And so, by definition, under legal definition, Black's Law Dictionary, the word adjacent means near to and not touching. Thus, it appeared that Congress reserved the right of federal agencies to regulate wetlands near navigable waters, not just those with a continuous surface connection like shoreline wetlands. All presidential administrations had interpreted rulemaking and jurisdictional interpretations over the time. And so jurisdiction interpretation is done by the Army Corps of Engineers on a case-by-case basis, where they send a wetland, someone sends a wetland biologist or delineator out to delineate the site. They send that report to the Army Corps of Engineers, and they make confirmation of whether or not those are jurisdictional wetlands. Example here of one of those wetland projects that I have done. And then the outcome of the Sackett versus the Environmental Protection Agency case was that the court said, no, adjacent doesn't mean near to, it actually means touching. Those wetlands have to touch the surface water. And so the court said that it must have a continuous surface connection to a water body like a stream, lake, or ocean, such there is no clear demarcation between these two bodies. And so this came out of private property here in Priest Lake in Idaho. You can see this property is next to areas that were already developed. And so the Sackett family thought, okay, we can develop this. There are utility hookups on site. They started to fill in the wetlands with gravel. Likely a neighbor ratted them out to the EPA. The Oregon government agency said, you must stop and insist doing what you're doing with filling these wetlands. The Sackett sued, and 20 years later there was a court case. Well, with the Sackett family property, one of the things the Supreme Court considered was, what's the connection to navigable water? And I think one of the things that the scientific community really failed in doing is explaining how waters here from the property connect down through this tributary, and what you do on a site can have downstream impact. Now that doesn't necessarily mean the Sacketts couldn't develop their property. They could. They just had to get a permit to do so to avoid, minimize, and mitigate for those wetlands. But the frustrating part is this is the case that decided the future of the Clean Water Act. In the grand scheme of things, was that going to really impact the water quality if somebody built a house on that property of Priest Lake? And that's a legitimate question to ask, and I think that's why the Supreme Court went in the direction it did. But the Supreme Court made a decision that's in conflict with what the public wants. The New York Times and SCOTUS poll said that the public broadly supports broad inclusion of things like wetlands. And so the 5-4 decision on needing a continuous surface connection meant that the law stands now on narrow grounds. So in the January issue, we highlight this change and the changes over time, and it's difficult to see from the back of the room, but basically I'll point out here that when the final rule gets released, we know that wetlands that don't have that continuous surface connection are no longer covered under the Clean Water Act, so there's no core federal jurisdiction. We know that interstate waters, the definition has changed such that just being interstate waters does not bring you under jurisdiction. And we know that intermittent streams and rivers and ephemeral rivers and floodplain wetlands, these are no longer necessarily covered under the Clean Water Act. And what we've realized is further changes now have to be done by Congress. And Congress is now responsible for defining what waters in the United States means. Because if you leave it up to the court systems and federal presidential administrations that change every 4 years, this is the result that you get. Why is this a problem? Some people say, well, leave it up to the states. Well, the problem with the states is 24 states have no protections beyond the Clean Water Act. They rely solely on the Clean Water Act. And then there are only there's 7 that have limited additional coverage. Here in the Northeast, we have broad coverage of non-WOTUS waters, but that broad coverage comes with reduced protections in the form of penalties. And if you look at state penalties, they're often much smaller than federal penalties when it's the same wetland under jurisdictions for both. And these are some unpublished data I have for the states that I'm currently working on. These are the WOTUS-dependent states in the Ohio River Basin: Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Mississippi, and all the other states have fines that are vastly lower than the federal government. The teeth of the federal government and the Department of Justice is what's keep people from abiding by the law. So another challenge is that under this revised definition, under other legal activities like undermining streams in Pennsylvania, in these long coal mines, you can undermine a stream, dewater that stream, and essentially if it was a perennial stream, you could take it out of federal protection by doing an otherwise legal activity. So one of the states like Pennsylvania and other states haven't considered the cascading effects yet from the collective destruction of these environments. And the other thing of arguing that the states will pick up the lead, since Sackett versus EPA, some states have actually failed to protect wetlands or have looked to reduce protections. Here are a couple examples: Illinois and Tennessee, but I've also seen this for North Carolina. Indiana has already made changes to their law reducing protections for wetlands, especially with regard to waterfowl and migratory birdways. So these changes mean that scientists that are knowledgeable on these issues have to remain informed and vigilant and also communicate the science. Why? Many of our imperial fish species are headwater dependent, and even those that aren't are at risk. This is an example of Cottonwood Creek in Colorado. Cottonwood gets spring snowmelt. The suckers and chubs swim upstream to spawn. By the time summer rolls around, that stream is dry. These streams are not likely to be protected under the revised rule when it's finalized. What happens when you list a species? Well, there have been recent criticisms of the Endangered Species Act by policymakers that the law is not recovering species and needs to be changed. And so policymakers are looking to change the law. This is another comment that we did on a proposed change to definition of habitat, definition of critical habitat, recently under the Endangered Species Act. And this proposed rule would undermine science-based endangered species work. And we, as a society, have a long history of engaging on this issue. The different divisions have a long history of engaging on endangered species. If you look back at the meeting minutes, the Northeastern Division dealt with pollution and its impact on rare and imperial species. The North Central Division dealt with dams being built on the Missouri River. The Southern Division dealt with mining and timber harvest and the impact it was having on fish. And the Western Division dealt with water rights, water access, and withdrawal of water that was causing impairment of fish species. So in 1964, the American Fisheries Society started an Endangered Species Committee. It wasn't until 9 years later of this continued engagement that we had the Federal Endangered Species Act. There were prior laws, but they didn't have the teeth. And this has continued over time. There's been a long history of AFS members engaging on this issue. And Phil Peaster, when he salvaged the remaining population of 200 Owens fish at Fish Slough in California in 1969 in two buckets, he realized he needed to start engaging on this issue. And he did to the point where the scientific societies brought him to Washington, D.C. to engage with AAAS to give a talk on the plight of rare species in the West that were declining as a result of dewatering their environments. And when a policymaker said, "What good are they?" Phil Peaster replied to, "Well, what good are you?" So he knew, like, hey, defend what you're doing for the planet, and then we'll talk about what the fish is doing for the planet. So people like Phil were instrumental in the early process of getting the Endangered Species Act passed. Under the Endangered Species Act, the agencies have to develop recovery plans for the conservation of survival. And in each plan, they have to have site-specific management actions, objective and measurable criteria, and estimates of the time and cost required to delist that species. And generally, there are two approaches to set quantifiable recovery goals. One would be a population dynamics approach, and a second would be a biogeography approach. In population dynamics, this is a little bit more difficult because you have to have more data. And there are only about 7 of our 100 and so fish that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages that actually have a PVA, population viability analysis approach. Most of them are going to have a biogeography approach because data were collected differently over time, and you take an approach of how many populations are there over a wider given area, and is there resilience in the ecosystem? Can you have threats abatement by redundancy of populations? And in 2006, the Government Accountability Office reviewed 107 randomly selected recovery plans from all listed taxa, and they found that a lot of these plans just didn't meet the requirements under the law. Only 32% had an estimated time to recover, and 19% had an estimated cost to recover it, and more than 95% failed to cover all 5 delisting factors. So we, working on policy, the AFS said, what do we know about, what can we find out about the listed fish species? And so we looked at mostly inland and some coastal fish species the Fish and Wildlife Service manages, and 55 out of 105 had an estimated time to recover. But for a lot of these fish, the estimated date of recovery had long passed. And the example here, the Maltese, the delisting could be initiated in 2009 if reclassification of threat status occurs as scheduled. That didn't happen. And so one of the challenges is we are not adequately funding the goals of the Act as a society to make sure these fish get recovered and delisted. And fewer fish recovery plans have an estimated cost to recover. Often in the recovery plans, there might be a 3-year budget and that's it. Well, the agency, under the law that Congress required the agency to revisit these and adjust and adapt for the cost to recover so that people could plan and that the public wasn't concerned about species being listed in perpetuity. And then the goal from the Department of Interior in 2018 to 2022 was to have 100% of recovery plans with quantitative recovery criteria. And they started to amend or address those outdated plans. And an example was the Wee Sucker that I'll come back to here in a moment as being a success story. So the comment that the act has not been successful is just not true. And it's up to us as people that work in the profession to point this out for the fish species that have been recovered and listed. These recovery success stories often take decades of interdisciplinary teams, agencies working together, and the Oregon chub was one of these success stories based on science-based protocol using population data and biogeography. Another thing that Oregon did was they committed a certain amount of their lottery revenue to watershed conservation efforts, not just to help salmon, but to help the species like the Oregon chub and the Modoc sucker, present in northern Oregon. And it was a recovery success because of science-based protocol using this biogeographic approach. They didn't have adequate data to compare over time, but they knew where populations were. They started to work with landowners to address cattle in streams and water pollution entering the streams, and eventually the Modoc sucker recovered to the point that it was satisfactory for delisting the species. It met the recovery criteria. Another example is the Fosket speckled dace, recovered in 2019. This was much simpler. It was just a matter of protecting grazing habitat on BLM land by putting up fencing and making sure that invasive plants weren't encroaching on this habitat. It has a habitat the size of this room, but it has been recovered because it's been protected. And then the Borax Lake chub recovery in 2020 was due to improved population status and also private land being protected by the Nature Conservancy. And so the agency was satisfied that population increased and the habitat was protected in perpetuity. Other recent examples include the Okaloosa darter, the Apache trout, the Roanoke bog perch, and the snail darter. And then even ones that haven't been delisted, there have been conservation success stories. So you can get a permit from the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe to fish for the local cutthroat trout. So it's people that went to the Reno meeting for AFS in 2019. There were some people that went after to the meeting. I went for a tour of the hatchery. Some people went for fishing. These two species have been success stories because of interagency partnerships with the tribal government to restore the fishery. So some of the solutions we found in reviewing these recovery plans that we could reduce these costs by every time that there's a 5-year recovery plan done, we could just review the recovery plan documents, which may be the most cost-effective approach. And then a new thing for endangered species are these species status assessments. And there have only been a handful for fish species, but as these are developed, recovery plans can also be revised or amended for some of our listed fish. So, talked about how AFS is engaged, and the last thing I want to address is how I'm thinking about addressing and helping students, the next generation of fisheries and aquatic resource professionals, to communicate science, risk, and to policymakers. And what I want you to do is, real briefly, is think about your most memorable undergraduate course before I introduce mine. So when I first took over the environmental law and policy class from the environmental studies program at the University of Pittsburgh, I thought, what was my most memorable course? Well, and how could I adapt this course to be like that? Well, it was one taught by Karen Blattfelty and Jim Finley, and they published a paper on this. It was prior to when I took the course with Paula Ferreri, past president of the Northeastern division. Paula didn't teach that course, but Karen Blattfelty and Jim Finley did, and one of the things they did was have students work, in my class, worked on a private hunting and fishing club in the Poconos on a management plan for this 3,000-acre club. And I learned the value of working in a team and then applying things we learned in other classes to solve a problem and deliver a product. And so I thought, how can I do that for my classes? Well, I've also had science communication training for engaging with journalists, engaging with policymakers through the communication partnership with Science in the Sea. And Nancy Barron worked for them as the Director of Science Outreach for 22 years. And she wrote, if young scientists are going to hone their communication skills, they need the support of senior scientists to protect their interests and reputations, teaching them things like if-then statements in addressing policymakers. And the Communication Partnership for Science in the Sea was developed out of ideas for fisheries professionals, oceanographers, working in marine systems, realizing, like Jane Luchenko, realizing they needed to do a better job communicating their science to policymakers because they saw the risk of not doing so. So one of the things they developed was this message box, and I have copies of this in a folder. If students want to practice this for their posters, come see me and grab a message box. I can walk you through it. Basically, it's a tool that you can fill out to ease the burden of communicating with people that might ask you questions. And I found this incredibly helpful for my own work. So basically, you fill out what the issue is and who your audiences you're addressing. What are the problems involved in the thing you're working on? What are the benefits of resolving those problems? What are the solutions that you have an idea for fixing? And then so what? Why should we care? Why should society care? Why should this person in Congress care? Why should the journalist care about this? So CompassSciComm.org, they have this and a workbook free online to do this. You don't have to go through their workshops. They provide some of this material. So these workshops organized by Compass were helpful in me building the science and communication skills to engage with journalists, policymakers, made mistakes in a safe environment, and I applied those skills in a less safe environment. And we did that, AFS did that last June, going down to Congress to engage on the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act and other issues that we realized we're facing. And some of these mistakes in growth opportunities in workshops, meetings, interviews, they prepared me for future opportunities. So when I was doing river paddle outreach on my temperature and brook trout research on the Amacogga River, there was someone from the local radio station, public radio station, Carl Habeck from WOTV on the Coudray Reservation said, hey, do you want to come on the radio for a 30-minute segment tomorrow and do it live? And I said, sure, that sounds like fun. I was nervous, but I filled out my message box on a field paper I had, and I did it and I stuck to the message. It didn't stray from what I wanted to say. And one of the risks of not engaging in policy